In the spring of 1972, most Americans had already written off Vietnam. President Richard Nixon was bringing the boys home, drawing down forces from 500,000 to just a few thousand advisors and support troops. The draft had ended, combat units had departed. For all practical purposes, the American war in Vietnam was over, but the North Vietnamese had other plans. On Good Friday, March 30th, 1972, 3 days before Easter, General Vo Nguyen Giap launched the largest conventional military offensive since the Korean War. 120,000 North Vietnamese army troops, backed by 600 Soviet-made tanks and heavy artillery, came pouring across the DMZ, out of Laos and from sanctuaries in Cambodia. They struck with a fury unseen since the Tet Offensive 4 years earlier. This was not guerrilla warfare. This was conventional combined arms assault on a massive scale. 3 separate invasion prongs drove into South Vietnam simultaneously. In the north, 3 divisions stormed across the demilitarized zone toward Quang Tri and Hue. In the central highlands, 2 more divisions attacked Kon Tum, and in the south, 3 divisions crossed from Cambodia into Bin Long province, with a single objective: capture An Loc, then drive down Highway 13 straight into Saigon, 65 miles away. The Americans called it the Easter Offensive. Hanoi named it the Nguyen Hue Campaign, after an emperor who had united Vietnam in the 1700s by defeating a Chinese invasion army. The symbolism was deliberate. General Giap intended to unite Vietnam again by force, and he intended to do it before the American election in November. If An Loc fell, there were no South Vietnamese forces positioned to stop the North Vietnamese army from reaching Saigon. President Nguyen Van Thieu understood this with absolute clarity. He issued a direct order to his military commanders: An Loc must be held at all costs. That order would put approximately 6,800 South Vietnamese soldiers and a handful of American advisors into a siege that would last 66 days and become the decisive battle of 1972. An Loc sits in Bin Long province, about 65 miles north of Saigon. Before the war, it had been a prosperous rubber plantation town of about 15,000 people, surrounded by vast plantations totaling 75,000 acres of French-planted rubber trees. The town itself was unremarkable: a provincial capital with a small airfield, some concrete buildings, and a soccer field that would become critical to its survival. The city sat astride Highway 13, a paved road that ran straight from the Cambodian border down to Saigon. For the North Vietnamese, that highway was a dagger pointed at the heart of South Vietnam. If they could take An Loc and hold it, they could use it as a staging base for the final assault on the capital. General Giap envisioned proclaiming An Loc as the capital of a revolutionary provisional government, then using it as the springboard for toppling the Thieu regime. Only one South Vietnamese division, the 5th ARVN Division, was stationed in Bin Long province. Against them, the North Vietnamese massed 3 full divisions: the 5th NVA Division, the 7th NVA Division, and the 9th Viet Cong Division. These were not ragtag guerrilla units. They were fully equipped combined arms divisions with Soviet tanks, 130mm field guns, 122mm rockets, and anti-aircraft missiles. The offensive in Bin Long province began on April 5th when the NVA 5th Division attacked Loc Ninh, a small district town 20 miles north of An Loc on the Cambodian border. Despite heavy American air support coordinated by advisors on the ground, the superior numbers of North Vietnamese troops overwhelmed the defenders after 3 days of brutal fighting. Loc Ninh fell on April 7th. The road to An Loc was now open. On April 7th, the same day Loc Ninh fell, the NVA 7th Division cut Highway 13 15 kilometers south of An Loc, severing the only ground supply route. The NVA then destroyed the small airfield at Quan Loi, just 2 miles northeast of An Loc. The South Vietnamese garrison was now completely isolated, surrounded by approximately 30,000 North Vietnamese troops who were positioning tanks, artillery, and anti-aircraft weapons for the final assault. Inside An Loc, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The 5th ARVN Division, commanded by Brigadier General Le Van Hung, was down to about 3,000 combat effectives after withdrawing from firebases north of the city. Mixed in with them were provincial militia, regional force troops, and various support units, bringing total strength to approximately 6,800. Against them were massing 3 North Vietnamese divisions, where the senior American advisor to the 5th Division was Colonel William Miller. Miller was a veteran officer who had served in World War II and Korea before deploying to Vietnam. He understood what was coming. The North Vietnamese were not going to bypass An Loc. They were going to try to annihilate the garrison and take the city as a trophy. On April 7th, President Thieu convened an emergency meeting in Saigon with his key advisors and corps commanders. The military situation was grim. Lieutenant General Nguyen Van Minh, commander of Military Region 3, outlined the crisis. An Loc was surrounded. Highway 13 was cut. The only resupply route would be by air, and the North Vietnamese had positioned heavy anti-aircraft weapons throughout the area. Sitting in that meeting was Major General James F. Hollingsworth, commander of the 3rd Regional Assistance Command. Hollingsworth was responsible for all American advisors in Military Region 3, the area north of Saigon extending to the Cambodian border. At 54 years old, Hollingsworth was a living legend among American military men. Born on a farm in Sanger, Texas, Hollingsworth had graduated from Texas A&M University in 1940 as a second lieutenant. He had gone to war under General George S. Patton, commanding tanks in the 2nd Armoured Division from North Africa in 1942 through the occupation of Berlin in 1945. During the race across France, Hollingsworth had encountered dug-in German defenders. He lined up his 34 tanks and gave an order rarely heard in modern warfare: "Charge!" The Germans broke and ran. Patton later recognised Hollingsworth as one of the 2 best armoured battalion commanders in the entire war. Now, 30 years later, Hollingsworth was back at war. He had earned 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, America's 2nd highest award for valour, 4 Silver Stars, 6 Purple Hearts, 4 Distinguished Service Medals, 38 Air Medals. He led from the front, and his men loved him for it. Hollingsworth's radio call sign was Danger 79er. It would become legendary during the Siege of An Loc. At the April 7th strategy meeting, Hollingsworth urged General Minh to reinforce An Loc immediately. The 1st Airborne Brigade, augmented by the 81st Airborne Ranger Battalion, was assembled south of the city. These were elite South Vietnamese troops, paratroopers and rangers who represented the best of the ARVN. Hollingsworth recommended they be committed to break through to An Loc. There was just one problem. Between them and An Loc stood the NVA 7th Division, 8,600 veteran soldiers who had prepared extensive defensive positions along Highway 13. When the Airborne Brigade attempted to fight through, they were stopped cold. The NVA was too strong, too well dug in. Hollingsworth quickly revised the plan. Instead of trying to fight up Highway 13, the airborne troops would be flown directly into An Loc by helicopter. It was an audacious plan. The NVA had surrounded the city with anti-aircraft weapons specifically to prevent aerial reinforcement, but Hollingsworth believed American airpower could suppress the defences long enough to get the paratroopers in. He was right. On April 9th, the 1st Airborne Brigade and 81st Rangers were successfully airlifted into An Loc's southern perimeter. The garrison now had approximately 10,000 troops, including some of South Vietnam's finest soldiers. They would need every man. The first major assault came on April 13th. At dawn, North Vietnamese artillery opened up with a barrage unlike anything the defenders had ever experienced. Hundreds of rockets and artillery shells hammered the city in a concentrated bombardment designed to break the defenders' will. Then, through the smoke and dust, came the tanks. The South Vietnamese soldiers had never fought tanks before. When Soviet-made T-54 medium tanks and PT-76 light tanks came rolling down the main street supported by infantry, panic rippled through the defenders. Some units broke and ran. The tanks seemed unstoppable, massive steel monsters firing their guns at point-blank range. Then an ARVN infantryman, his name lost to history, stepped into the street with an M72 light anti-tank weapon. The law was a disposable shoulder-fired rocket, standard issue to American forces but relatively new to the ARVN. The soldier aimed, fired, and destroyed the lead T-54. The tank exploded in a ball of flame. The attack stalled. Other ARVN troops, seeing that the tanks could be killed, grabbed their own LAWs and went to work. They knocked out tank after tank in close-range street fighting. American Cobra attack helicopters swooped in, their Tau missiles adding to the destruction. By the end of the first day, 23 North Vietnamese tanks were burning wrecks in the streets of An Loc. But the city was now a battleground. The North Vietnamese held the northern neighbourhoods. The South Vietnamese controlled the southern sector. The two forces were locked in brutal house-to-house fighting, separated sometimes by just a single street or building. Colonel Miller sent situation reports back to Major General Hollingsworth that painted a grim picture. The enemy was still flinging 2,000 shells a day into An Loc. Casualties continued to mount. Medical supplies were running low. The wounded were a major problem. There were mass burials for both military and civilians. The city was being destroyed around them. For the American advisors scattered among the ARVN units, life became a daily struggle for survival. They lived in bunkers and basements, emerging only when necessary to coordinate airstrikes or adjust artillery fire. Sleep was nearly impossible. The North Vietnamese shelled the city around the clock, sometimes firing for hours without pause. The advisors learned to tell the difference between incoming artillery by sound. The whoosh of Soviet 130mm field guns, the shriek of 122mm rockets, the crack of smaller caliber weapons. Water was rationed. Food consisted mainly of rice and whatever could be salvaged from airdropped supplies. Many of the supply bundles landed outside the defensive perimeter, where the North Vietnamese recovered them. The advisors and ARVN troops watched helplessly as parachutes drifted past their positions, carrying desperately needed ammunition and food to the enemy. The heat was oppressive. April and May are the hottest months in Vietnam. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. The bunkers and fighting positions offered no relief, only stifling humidity and the constant stench of death. Bodies could not always be recovered and buried. They lay in the streets and rubble, decomposing in the tropical heat. Evacuating the wounded was nearly impossible. The North Vietnamese had positioned SA-7 Strela shoulder-fired heat, seeking missiles throughout the area. South Vietnamese helicopters attempting to land in An Loc were almost invariably shot down. The evacuation effort was abandoned. The wounded would have to stay and fight or die where they fell. Every single thing the garrison needed, from ammunition to food to medical supplies, would have to be delivered by air. And that meant flying through some of the most intense anti-aircraft fire in the history of aerial warfare. The American C-130. Hercules crews who would undertake this mission were not supposed to be in combat anymore. Most of the C-130 fleet had already left Southeast Asia. By April 1972, only one wing remained, the 374th Tactical Airlift Wing based at Chingchuan-Kang Air Base on Taiwan. Another squadron at Clark Air Base in the Philippines was in the process of deactivating. The C-130 force that had seen heavy action in 1968 and 69 had spent nearly 2 years flying basic logistics missions. Consequently, only a handful of crews still maintained tactical proficiency. The pilots and crew members who had seen heavy combat had mostly rotated home. They had been replaced by young men fresh out of training and others coming from Military Airlift Command C-141 Starlifters and Strategic Air Command bombers. These crews had not trained for combat delivery. They were transport pilots being asked to fly into hell. The first resupply attempts used standard container delivery system procedures, dropping from 700 feet in 3 ship formations. The C-123s and C-119 providers made the first attempts on April 12th through 14th. Out of 135 tons dropped in those 3 days, only 34 tons were recovered inside the defensive perimeter. The rest fell outside, where the North Vietnamese recovered it. 6 aircraft took ground fire. The losses were unsustainable. On April 15th, Siesta C-123 provider was shot down while dropping supplies. The plane crashed and burned. Everyone aboard was killed, including the squadron commander. 4 days later, another C-123 was shot down with no survivors. The Air Force switched to C-130s and tried to develop new tactics that would improve accuracy while reducing aircraft vulnerability. They were learning as they went, adapting on the fly, making it up as the mission demanded. On April 15th, 1972, a C-130E with tail number 62-1787, callsign Spare 617, attempted to airdrop ammunition to the besieged garrison. The crew consisted of Aircraft Commander Captain Bill Caldwell, co-pilot First Lieutenant John Herring, navigator First Lieutenant Rick Lentz, Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant John Sanders, and Loadmasters Staff Sergeant Charlie Shaub and Airman First Class David McAleese. They were carrying 12 pallets of 105mm howitzer shells, nearly 30,000 pounds of explosives. The drop zone was a soccer field in a schoolyard, approximately 270 yards square. a tiny target in the middle of a city surrounded by anti-aircraft guns. As Spare 617 made its approach, forward air controllers reported small arms fire. They said an C-130 Spectre gunship and 2 South Vietnamese A-37 Dragonflies were providing fire suppression. The first aircraft in the formation had taken just one hit in the vertical stabilizer. The FACs told the C-130 crew they should not have any problems with enemy ground fire. They were catastrophically wrong. The North Vietnamese had learned from the first aircraft. They had repositioned their anti-aircraft guns and were waiting. As Captain Caldwell lined up for the drop, the North Vietnamese opened up with everything they had: 37mm anti-aircraft guns, 51 caliber heavy machine guns, automatic weapons fire. The sky around the C-130 erupted in explosions and tracers. The aircraft was hit immediately. 87 rounds slammed into the right side of the fuselage. Engines 3 and 4 took 12 rounds of 51 caliber shells. Shrapnel tore through the cargo compartment. 2 of the ammunition pallets exploded inside the aircraft, the blast tearing through the fuselage and starting a fire. Captain Caldwell had seconds to make a decision. His aircraft was on fire, and carrying tons of high explosives that could detonate at any moment. He could abort the mission and try to save his crew, or he could complete the drop and give the besieged garrison the ammunition they desperately needed. Caldwell continued the approach. Loadmaster Staff Sergeant Charlie Shorb, wounded by shrapnel, stayed at his position and released the cargo. All 12 pallets went out the back, tumbling toward the drop zone as Spare 617 pulled up and away, trailing smoke and fire. The crew fought desperately to control the burning aircraft. They were experiencing engine fire warnings, physical loss of flight control surfaces, and electrical, hydraulic, and pneumatic failures. The C-130 was coming apart in the air. Captain Caldwell nursed the stricken aircraft south, away from An Loc, trying to reach friendly territory. The fire was spreading. The controls were barely responding. They were not going to make it to any airfield. Army Captain Robert Frank, flying a Cobra gunship over An Loc, saw the burning C-130 fly past. He turned to his pilot and said, "That looks like a bad day." The Cobras followed the C-130, knowing the crew would have to bail out or crash land. Caldwell found a relatively clear patch of swampy ground and put the aircraft down. The C-130 ploughed through the marsh, shedding landing gear, parts of wings, nose and tail sections flying in all directions. The big plane burrowed into the swamp, spun around, broke in two, and burst into flames. Captain Frank thought no one could have survived. Then he saw Captain Caldwell emerge from the wreckage, followed by the rest of the crew. Miraculously, all 7 men had survived. The worst injury was a loadmaster who had been shot through the elbow by a small arms round during the approach. The Cobra helicopters landed and extracted the crew just as North Vietnamese troops began firing at them. The C-130 burned in the swamp, but the ammunition had been delivered. The garrison at An Loc had the shells they needed. For their actions on April 15th, Captain Bill Caldwell and Technical Sergeant Charlie Shorb each received the Air Force Cross, America's second highest award for valor. The aircraft, Spare 617, would eventually be recovered and is now on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, bullet holes and all, a testament to the courage of the men who flew it into hell. But the losses continued. On April 18th, another C-130 commanded by Captain Don Jensen was hit by anti-aircraft fire while making a drop. The right wing caught fire. Jensen jettisoned 30,000 pounds of Class A explosives to lighten the aircraft, then crash-landed in a swamp. Again, Army helicopters rescued the entire crew. The C-130 was a total loss. On April 25th, another C-130 was shot down. This time, there were no survivors. On May 3rd, yet another C-130 went down. Another crew lost. The Air Force had to find a better way. Engineers at Tactical Air Command Headquarters and the Tactical Air Warfare Center at Eglin Air Force Base developed a new high-velocity drop technique. 1,000-pound bundles were rigged to 15-foot slotted parachutes designed to stabilize descent at approximately 100 feet per second. With 4 times the normal impact velocity, the loads would hit hard, but they would be accurate. The C-130s began dropping from 5,000 feet, well above the effective range of most anti-aircraft weapons. Ground-based radar guided the drops. It was not perfect, but it worked. The supplies got through, and fewer aircraft were lost. From April through June, American C-130s flew hundreds of sorties into An Loc, delivering food, ammunition, medical supplies, and everything else the garrison needed to survive. It was a feat of aerial logistics that rivaled the Berlin airlift. The crews knew they were flying into one of the most dangerous places in Southeast Asia. They flew anyway because American advisors and South Vietnamese soldiers on the ground were counting on them. While the transport crews fought to keep the garrison supplied, American tactical air power hammered the North Vietnamese besieging the city. Major General Hollingsworth, coordinating from his headquarters at Long Binh, used every asset available. F-4 Phantoms and a 37 Dragonflies struck North Vietnamese positions around the clock. A C-130, Spectre gunships orbited over the city at night, their 105mm cannons creating rolling barrages that tore apart NVA infantry formations. Cobra attack helicopters provided close air support during the day, their 2 missiles killing tanks and their rockets shredding infantry. But the weapon that truly saved An Loc was the B-52 Stratofortress. The Strategic Air Command B-52 was designed to deliver nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union. It could carry 30 tons of conventional bombs. When those bombs were dropped in a concentrated pattern from 30,000 feet, they created a devastation zone 3/4 of a mile long and half a mile wide. Everything in that zone died. Hollingsworth had direct access to MACV Commander General Crichton Abrams. He used that connection to divert B-52 strikes from other areas to An Loc whenever the city was most seriously threatened. The results were catastrophic for the North Vietnamese. B-52 cells, groups of 3 aircraft, were guided onto target boxes by ground-based radar. American advisors on the ground called in coordinates for NVA troop concentrations, artillery positions and tank formations. Minutes later, the B-52s would arrive, invisible at 30,000 feet, and obliterate the targets. On May 11th and 12th, during the third and heaviest North Vietnamese assault on An Loc, the Air Force flew a B-52 mission every 55 minutes for 30 consecutive hours. 170 B-52 bombers participated, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on the North Vietnamese divisions surrounding the city. The bombardment was so intense that entire regiments simply ceased to exist. The NVA had advanced to within a few hundred meters of the 5th Division command post when the B-52 strikes began. The ground shook continuously for 30 hours. The NVA advance stopped. Then it reversed. The surviving North Vietnamese soldiers pulled back, stunned and demoralized by the unrelenting bombardment. American advisors on the ground witnessed the effects firsthand. Major John Howard, an advisor with the 1st Airborne Brigade, described An Loc as a landscape of graves, burned-out vehicles, and rubble, mute testimony to the intensity of the battle. The city was being systematically destroyed, but it was still in South Vietnamese hands. Major General Hollingsworth became the hero of An Loc through his constant presence and unwavering support. He flew into the city daily during the worst of the shelling, his helicopter landing under fire so he could personally encourage the South Vietnamese commanders and American advisors defending the city. His call sign, Danger 79er, became synonymous with American resolve. When things were at their darkest, when the situation seemed hopeless, Hollingsworth would be overhead or on the ground, coordinating fire support, boosting morale, making sure everyone knew they were not alone. Then he developed a reputation for blunt talk that sometimes got him into trouble with his superiors, but endeared him to the men on the ground. When reporters asked about his strategy for dealing with the North Vietnamese, Hollingsworth replied, "I am going to kill them all before they get back to Cambodia. I am moving to the north, and I am exploiting the success we had at An Loc. It feels real good to be killing hell out of the communists." The comments ignited a firestorm back in Washington. President Nixon's advisors were concerned about the optics of an American general boasting about killing communists when the official policy was Vietnamization and disengagement. But General Crichton Abrams, Hollingsworth's boss and another pattern-trained fighter, backed him completely. Abrams knew that Hollingsworth was doing exactly what needed to be done. The advisors in An Loc idolized Hollingsworth. They were eternally grateful for the massive air support he marshaled that helped turn the tide of the battle. Without him, An Loc would have fallen. Through April and May, the North Vietnamese launched 3 major assaults on An Loc, each one more desperate than the last. They threw tank after tank into the city, only to see them destroyed by law rockets, tow missiles, and airstrikes. They massed infantry for human wave attacks, only to be shredded by artillery, gunships, and B-52 strikes. The NVA High Command was furious at the failure to quickly capture An Loc. General Giap had planned to announce An Loc as the revolutionary capital on April 20th. That deadline came and went with the city still in South Vietnamese hands. Giap sent increasingly frantic orders demanding that his divisions take the city immediately. They tried, they failed, they died by the thousands. The siege raged through May. The North Vietnamese continued to shell the city relentlessly. By the end of the siege, an estimated 78,000 artillery and rocket rounds had fallen on An Loc. The city was reduced to rubble. Every building was damaged. Many were completely destroyed. The civilian population had either fled or were huddled in basements and bunkers, praying for survival. The South Vietnamese defenders held. The 5th Division, the Airborne Brigade, the Rangers, they all held their positions and fought back. They were outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded, under constant bombardment, but they refused to break. By early June, the North Vietnamese offensive was clearly failing. Around the clock, airstrikes had taken a horrendous toll on NVA formations. South Vietnamese intelligence estimated that communist forces sustained 10,000 casualties at An Loc during April and May alone. 3 of North Vietnam's finest divisions had been shattered trying to take one city. On June 13th and 14th, elements of the 18th ARVN Division were airlifted into An Loc to reinforce the exhausted 5th Division. On June 17th, the 48th Regiment of the 18th Division reoccupied Hill 169, allowing them to guide air and artillery strikes on remaining NVA forces. On June 18, 1972, 66 days after the siege began, President Thieu declared the siege broken. The 3rd Corps commander released the 1st Airborne Brigade to return to its parent unit. An Loc had held. The siege was not completely over. North Vietnamese artillery continued to shell the city sporadically for months afterward. On July 9th, Brigadier General Richard J. Tallman, Deputy Commander of 3rd Regional Assistance Command, landed at An Loc to inspect the situation. Within minutes of landing, he and his party were hit by NVA artillery fire. 3 men were killed instantly. Tallman and 2 others were wounded. The general was evacuated to the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon, where he died of his wounds. He was the last United States Army general to die in South Vietnam. The Battle of An Loc was the most protracted engagement of the 1972 Easter Offensive. The ARVN defenders sustained 5,400 casualties, including 2,300 killed or missing. Many of the American advisors had been wounded at least once. The city itself was almost totally destroyed, every building damaged, most reduced to rubble. But An Loc had not fallen. The North Vietnamese had committed 3 divisions, over 30,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and massive artillery support to capture one city. They had failed completely. The cost to the NVA was catastrophic. Intelligence estimates placed their casualties at over 10,000 killed in April and May alone, with total casualties likely much higher. The strategic significance of An Loc cannot be overstated. If the city had fallen in April or May, the North Vietnamese would have had a clear road to Saigon. There were no other South Vietnamese forces positioned to stop them. The capital would have been directly threatened, possibly leading to the collapse of the Thieu government and the end of South Vietnam in 1972, 3 years before it actually fell. Instead, An Loc held. The Easter Offensive was blunted. General Giap's plan to win the war in a single campaign failed. The North Vietnamese were forced back into their Cambodian sanctuaries to lick their wounds and rebuild their shattered divisions. For the American military, An Loc represented the ultimate validation of Vietnamization. A relatively small force of South Vietnamese troops, advised and supported by a handful of American advisors and backed by overwhelming American air power, had defeated a major North Vietnamese offensive. The South Vietnamese soldiers fought with courage and determination. They held their ground against overwhelming odds. The American contribution to the victory was decisive. The C-130 crews who flew into An Loc under fire, delivering the supplies that kept the garrison alive, the tactical air crews who provided close air support around the clock, the B-52 crews who flew mission after mission, dropping thousands of tons of ordnance on the besieging forces, the helicopter crews who extracted wounded and inserted reinforcements under fire, the advisors on the ground who called in the airstrikes, coordinated the defences, and fought alongside their South Vietnamese counterparts, and Major General James F. Hollingsworth, whose leadership, determination, and sheer force of personality kept the whole operation together when it seemed ready to collapse. His daily presence over An Loc, his ability to marshal massive air support at critical moments, his unwavering confidence in ultimate victory. These were the intangibles that made the difference between success and failure. Today, few Americans know about the Battle of An Loc. It happened after most American combat forces had already come home. The news media had largely lost interest in Vietnam by 1972, focusing instead on the presidential election and Watergate. The story of An Loc did not fit the prevailing narrative that the war was unwinnable and South Vietnam was doomed to fall. But for a few months in the spring of 1972, An Loc was the most important piece of ground in Southeast Asia. If it fell, Saigon fell. If Saigon fell, South Vietnam fell. The fate of an entire nation hung on a small city surrounded by rubber plantations. The men who defended An Loc, South Vietnamese and American alike, understood what was at stake. They fought with everything they had. The South Vietnamese soldiers held their positions against tank assaults and artillery barrages that would have broken lesser troops. The American advisors coordinated the defense and called in the airpower that turned the tide. The Air Force crews flew mission after mission into the most intense anti-aircraft fire they had ever seen, knowing that men on the ground were depending on them. For 66 days they held, for 66 days they fought, and in the end they won. The victory at An Loc bought South Vietnam 3 more years. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. The last American combat forces departed by March. Without American air support and advisors, the South Vietnamese military would eventually prove unable to stand alone against the North. Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975. But in the spring of 1972, at a small city surrounded by 30,000 North Vietnamese troops, outnumbered defenders held the line. They proved that with American support, South Vietnamese forces could defeat the best divisions North Vietnam could throw at them. They proved that courage and determination, backed by American airpower and advisors, could overcome overwhelming odds. The Siege of An Loc stands as one of the great defensive battles of the 20th century. Like Bastogne in World War II or Khe Sanh earlier in Vietnam, it was a siege where surrounded defenders held against vastly superior forces and emerged victorious. The South Vietnamese soldiers who fought there earned the right to stand alongside any soldiers in American military history. The American advisors and air crews who supported them upheld the finest traditions of American arms. Major General Hollingsworth retired in 1976 as a 3-star general. He went on to serve his country as a civilian military advisor during the Cold War, evaluating American military capabilities and helping to rebuild the army after Vietnam. He died on March 2, 2010, and was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His statue stands at Texas A&M University, one of only 3 Aggies so honored, and is alongside Lawrence Sullivan Ross and James Earl Rudder. The inscription on his statue reads, "He was revered by his troops and feared by the enemy as a warrior who was always on the scene in times of need or at time of immense peril." Colonel William Miller, the senior advisor to the 5th ARVN Division, survived the siege. Like hundreds of other American advisors scattered throughout South Vietnam in 1972, he had served his country in an overlooked war, at a time when most Americans wanted to forget Vietnam existed. His service, and the service of all the advisors who fought in the Easter Offensive, deserves to be remembered. The C-130 crews who flew into An Loc under fire, some of them making the ultimate sacrifice, upheld the Air Force tradition of going in harm's way to support troops in contact. Their courage saved An Loc as surely as any airstrike or B-52 mission. The Siege of An Loc represents what the American military could accomplish in Vietnam when all the pieces came together. Well-trained South Vietnamese forces with competent leadership, American advisors who knew their jobs and had the confidence of their counterparts, tactical air support providing close air support around the clock, strategic bombers delivering overwhelming firepower at critical moments, and aggressive American leadership committed to winning. It also represents the tragedy of Vietnam. If this combination could work at An Loc, why couldn't it work everywhere? Why couldn't Vietnamization succeed in the long run? The answer involves politics, will, resources, leadership, and 100 other factors. But for 66 days in the spring of 1972, in a small city north of Saigon, it did work. The men who fought there, on the ground and in the air, South Vietnamese and American, proved what was possible. They deserve to be remembered for what they accomplished, saving South Vietnam for 3 more years defeating the best North Vietnam could throw at them and demonstrating the kind of courage under fire that defines the warrior spirit. An Loc held. Against all odds, surrounded by 30,000 enemy troops, pounded by 78,000 artillery rounds, the garrison held. That is the story that deserves to be told. That is the victory that should be remembered. That is the legacy of the 66-day Siege of An Loc.